Hi, I'm Maggie Gates. Welcome to Justice Matters. On today's episode of Justice Matters, I speak with Dr. Keisha Blain, professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University. A 2022 Guggenheim Fellow and class of 2022 Carnegie Fellow, Dr. Blain is one of the most innovative and influential young historians of her generation. She is an award-winning historian of the 20th century United States with broad interests and specializations in African American history, the modern African diaspora, and women and gender studies. She completed her PhD in history from Princeton University in 2014. In 2020, she was a fellow here at the Carr Ryan Center. A former columnist for MSNBC, Dr. Blain is now the editor-in-chief of Global Black Thought, a journal featuring original, innovative, and thoroughly researched essays on Black ideas, theories, and intellectuals in the United States and throughout the African diaspora. Blain is the author of the books Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, Wake Up America, Black Women on the Future of Democracy, and her latest work, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. Without Fear offers a sweeping history of human rights framed by the work and ideas of Black women in the United States from the early 19th century to the present. Dr. Blain, welcome to Justice Matters. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. May I call you Keisha?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. All right, your new book, Without Fear, shines a spotlight on Black American women who played a crucial role in shaping the modern human rights movement. And you really start right after the revolution, the American Revolution, and you go through the 19th and 20th centuries. What drew you to tell this particular story, and what do you think these incredible leaders' contributions reveal about that history?
So the first thing that I would say is that I have to credit the Carr Ryan Center for providing a space for me to begin writing this book. In fact, as you mentioned, I was a fellow in 2020, and I started that fall, and it really was a pivotal year, to say the least, in terms of the political landscape. When we think about political and social movements, 2020 was very significant for a number of reasons, not only on the national level, but on the global scale. And one of the things that I started thinking about at the time was the role that Black women were playing nationally and transnationally. As you mentioned, I've written about Black women's global politics before, so this is a subject that's not new to me. But I was struck by the way that the protests of 2020 brought to the surface Black women's leadership. So many people reached out to me in terms of journalists, for example, asking me to contextualize what they were seeing. For many individuals, it appeared that this was a moment where Black women were perhaps for the first time taking this very prominent role as leaders. We were seeing them on television, speaking about what was happening, speaking about state-sanctioned violence, talking about Black Lives Matter. All of these things were taking place in 2020, and I made it very clear then, as I do now, that it was not new. That in fact these women were building on a long legacy, a rich history of Black women's political activism. And if anything, if it seemed new, it would be because in the past, so much of the work that Black women do tend to be hidden from the public view. So we can see Black women as leaders behind the scenes, where in a more contemporary moment, we see Black women very visible as leaders, serving in official roles in so many different sectors of society. So while I was a fellow at the Carr Ryan Center, I was there initially because I was planning to finish a book. I was working on the Hamer book that you referenced, Until I Am Free. And I did finish that book, but in the process of finishing up that book, I started thinking deeply about what it would mean to write a history in which I would center Black women's ideas and activism. How could I tell a sweeping history of human rights in which Black women would be the focus, primarily Black women in the United States? But of course, it's impossible to talk about human rights unless you are thinking globally and thinking about transnational connections and so on. And so the Carr Ryan Center was a beautiful space in which to begin the project because I was having conversations with other fellows, with faculty, listening, learning from them. And I think some of the questions that people asked me at the time, or some of the even just the casual conversations, forced me to answer the question, what role did Black women play in shaping human
Mhm.
rights history? And I set out to answer that question in this book. I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said on the subject, but I do hope that I've been able to contribute something with this latest work, Without Fear. And we see really how Black women are shaping this history from the ground up, which is
Mhm.
very significant because so many times we focus on what we talk about as high politics, or we focus on the role of diplomats or the role of major organizations. And I'm not suggesting that we should not pay attention to that. We certainly should. But what I wanted to do in this book was pay attention to ordinary Black women, individuals who may not have even had access to many of these spaces, and just imagine and find out essentially what does the historical record tell us about how these women not only conceptualize human rights, but how they work to advance it
Mhm.
within their communities with the resources they had at the time in which they could do it. So I tried
Yeah.
to answer those questions in this project.
Yeah, I'm so happy you wrote this book because it's such an amazing and important story, of course. Um but it's also such a beautiful um sort of description and analysis of how generations of women understood themselves in the United States at a time for hundreds of years before they were full citizens, but also in the context of the rest of the world. And, you mentioned in your last answer that human rights, of course, is inherently global, but also Black intellectual thought is inherently global. And there's long, long, long roots of internationalism and international networks, and that does come through in this book that I know we'll talk about in a moment. Um, but your book is a powerful intellectual history of the development of the concept of human rights and the human rights movement that we would recognize today and how it started in the 19th century. Can you talk about how your protagonists throughout the book defined and understood human rights?
Yes, I think writing a book that offers this sweeping history and covering about 200 years, it's both exciting but difficult in the sense that, as you can imagine, there's so much change over time, and even as we're moving from space to space, from locale to locale, and from generation to generation, we're seeing the way that Black women are thinking about human rights, conceptualizing human rights, and how those ideas are being shaped by both national and global developments. So there's a lot to contextualize, and part of what I needed to do was figure out what are the core values, what are the core values that are guiding these women. How do they broadly conceptualize human rights, even as we can talk about some of the nuance, especially as we move forward in time. There's a way in which, by the time you get to post World War II, and I think my sense is that you can feel it in the book, so many things are shifting. Not surprisingly, because a lot is happening right on an international level, and you can see how it's influencing the day to day activism. But in broad strokes, I emphasize three core points which I find most useful from another a fellow historian, Lynn Hunt's work, Inventing Human Rights, and the three core values that I think we see coming through these women's ideas and their activism. One around equal rights, which is to advocate for um, rights that are essentially available to everyone, to all people, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of location, regardless of citizenship. All of these factors, uh, not really being significant because it's equal and applying to all people. And then the second concept of universal rights, which is to say that they're applicable everywhere. And so here is where these women are pushing back against a very U.S. centric, or this emphasis on, well, we are uh, do these protections because we are citizens of the United States. They do far more than that. They push beyond what I talk about as a somewhat narrow framing, and they say actually. forget the United States. We're due these rights because we're human, and that is the essence of it. That we should be protected, that we should be treated with dignity and respect, um, and and the only thing that matters here is that we're human, and so you don't even have to talk about the Constitution. You don't even have to make demands of the state and say, well, you should treat us this way because we were actually born in the United States. Like all of these are certainly important arguments, and help to contextualize a lot of what we talk about when we discuss, for example, the civil rights movement, which I had just written about for when I studied Fannie Lou Hamer. So I understood very much, and Fannie Lou Hamer was constantly appealing, to the U.S. Constitution, constantly talking about the Reconstruction Amendments, constantly making an argument for citizenship rights, and that is certainly important. But part of what I wanted to capture here was the way that these women are thinking broadly and saying, in fact, you should show us respect. You should grant us protection. We should not have to struggle to have quality housing, quality health care. All of these are basic necessities, and we should have them because we're human. And that's it. We don't need to make any other argument, quite frankly. And in making that particular case, they're able to then place pressure on the United States, and say, well, look what's happening. The US is trying to present itself as a beacon for global democracy, presenting itself as a leader in the world. And yet, look at how they are, in fact, denying human rights, not only to Black women, but to other groups. And so it is very much, I think, a political strategy, as much as it is an important claim that these women are making. So I try to focus on the core values, because, as you can imagine, as we're shifting across time, and the book moves forward, Black women are thinking about human rights in different ways, and they're very much drawing upon what's happening in the US and what's happening globally.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I love the um the long roots of this that you lay out so clearly, because I feel like it's so common to identify and sort of locate the spark of the civil rights movement and also the spark of an international understanding of a global human rights and human rights movement after the two major 20th century wars, World War One, World War Two, and you are showing this has much, much longer roots in our context. And even though a concept of a universal human rights movement may not have existed in 1832, people were talking about this and moving the needle forward, which is really fantastic and important, really important. Um, your book is a fundamental rewriting of the development of the human rights movement. And I love that it's not just, don't forget, Black women existed back then too, but more, much more. There were enormous networks and very powerful networks of human rights activists led by highly visible Black women across a couple of hundred of years, who were in coalition with others, explicitly defining and creating an understanding of fundamental human rights for all. That's remarkably powerful. So, how did your protagonists that you highlight throughout the book build and sustain these powerful networks? And how, in turn, then did those networks push a refinement and creation of what we now know as an international human rights movement?
So what's so fascinating, I think, about this project, and as I was doing the research, um, is it gave me a window into, you mentioned just the deep roots of the history. One of the reasons that I absolutely love studying intellectual history is that if we focus on organizations, for example, organizations come, organizations go. You might have an organization that exists very powerful in a particular moment, and then within maybe 5 or 6 years, the organization falters for a range of reasons, and then in some ways the story ends. What's powerful about studying the ideas is, for me, how it really transcends all of these. So whether we're talking about someone advocating for human rights in the 19th century within a particular context, so perhaps as part of a local organization, as part of a church, as part of a Black women's club. Um, and even when circumstances shift, whereby these groups may not be available uh, within a particular context, these women are still able to advance the work, and another generation follows. And in some ways, they pick up the mantle, and in some ways, they're able to push forth ideas generation after generation after generation. And if you see it through the intellectual threads, it really is an inspiring story, and you see more continuity rather than the fracture of the end of organization or someone passes away. Ideas persist, and they continue to shape and move people in interesting ways. So I'm always um, fascinated by this, and you see that. So these women do in fact rely on a number of groups. I mentioned churches as one example. Black women's clubs is another. Sororities as another. Spaces in which they're able to come together. They have similar goals and interests, and they're able to strategize to respond to developments of the moment. How do we make sure that we not only advocate for ourselves, but we advocate for other marginalized groups? What resources do we have in this particular moment to respond? And so they're asking these kinds of questions, and even when things seem to fall apart, you see them finding other avenues to continue the work. And that's one of I think, the most interesting aspects of this is the continuity. I try to show that not just through individuals who are advocating, uh, but I think to an extent, even organizations that are just as an example, we within the context of talking about the civil rights movement, we spend a lot of time talking about someone like Ella Baker, who's a very significant figure. One of the things that's interesting is, as I was doing the research, I started writing about someone by the name of Aretha McKinley, who was a lobbyist in DC, and I read about her in the 1950s. I did not know about her before I started writing the book, but came across her as I was doing the research. Really fascinating figure who spoke a lot about human rights, human dignity, advocated strongly for it. As I started putting the pieces together, I realized that she was part of the same NAACP chapter that Ella Baker was a part of. And I thought, oh, this is fascinating. And so you have these two figures who would have essentially been in the same space, same community, cross paths in New York City, and they end up moving in different directions, but very much connected. And it's just for me a way of capturing that the continuity, the strength of the ideas. So even as we talk about Ella Baker and we talk about her role in the civil rights movement, all of that is important. Here you have another figure, lesser known, who was in dialogue, right? Who was part of
Yeah.
this community, and then is able to. Then she becomes a lobbyist. She's in D.C. She's advocating for legislation. She's doing all these very interesting things on the ground, and so the two are connected. It's a story that just moves forward in fascinating ways. So I started seeing these threads as I was working on the book, and I think that's such a powerful story.
Absolutely. It's so easy to forget when we have such powerful hero and heroine figures that they existed in the world and, of course, had vast networks and friendships and all of this, of course. And so being able to reclaim that and make those connections is so amazing. Um, your women in the book use a million different strategies to do this work, and it's really, again, talking about the networks and the way they interchange with each other and build on each other. You have journalists like Ida B. Wells. You have lobbyists like who you're just talking about, Aretha. um, you have grassroots organizers and activists. There are people who are running political campaigns, who are um, traveling internationally and building big coalitions and networks intentionally. Um, and then, in fact, closer to the development of the actual UN, being involved with the creation of the UN. Were there any strategies that particularly stood out to you or were surprising to you as you were researching?
I think one of the things that I um, not so much surprising, but perhaps very inspiring. And it could be just because of my own experience and as a professor, I'm very drawn to the story of Aretha McKinley, who I mentioned earlier, but also Margaret Cartwright, who was a professor of sociology at Hunter College in the 1950s and 1960s. And I was so amazed by her story and particularly the method that she used. So she was an advocate for human rights. She was a writer. And one of the things that she did was she would travel extensively. I've I questioned as I was doing the research how in the world she managed a teaching load, and so I was digging through her collection to get a glimpse of her personal life because she managed quite a bit. And one of the things that she would do is she would go to these important gatherings just to listen, just to observe, and then she would write about them extensively. She had a column in the Pittsburgh Courier. She also wrote for New York Amsterdam News, and she said in her personal papers that it was important for her to do these things because she wanted to make sure that African Americans were kept fully abreast of developments that were taking place globally. And so she attended the Bandung Conference, perhaps the most significant Afro-Asian political gathering in 1955, and then she wrote about it and emphasize what she thought what she thought African Americans needed to know about that gathering, the significance, of course, but also just her observations as a Black woman being in the space. She did the same in 1958. She goes to Accra, Ghana. She's there for the All African Peoples Conference. She's not on the schedule. There are a few Black women from the United States even present there, but she goes and she takes careful notes, and then she goes back and she reports, and she's putting out just a ton of articles so that people will know what's happening. And she um, just takes on this role of also connector. So she's introducing world leaders to activists in the U.S. She's making sure that people know what is happening on the ground. She's traveling back and forth, and it's just a remarkable story. And you just, it was so. I remember just pausing and thinking, wow, this one person having this drive, feeling the need to make sure that essentially Black people were not left out of the conversation. That essentially that they would be fully aware of what was happening, and that information would inform their own strategies on the ground. And so she made the time. So even when she was doing research, she would travel to a particular place for research as she's working on her own projects, and she would line it up so she could attend a UN session. Or it was just a very careful planning of a person who just uh, recognized the power, certainly of the press, who recognized the significance of writing as a medium for advocacy, and also for really spreading knowledge across the nation and even on a global scale. So um, I just think those kinds of stories really stayed with me and inspired me. And I chuckled too because as busy as we are as individuals, there were moments when I thought, wow, this lady, how did she do it? I don't even know, but she was so deeply committed and found a way to balance all of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing she sort of adopted that role and did that for everybody. Could be the eyes and the ears in the room
Right.
where things were happening. It's really incredible. Continuing on this thread of sort of transnational alliances, you have some really other really amazing stories in the book. And a couple of them were surprising to me, and I imagine would be surprising to some of the readers of the book. So, um, I think for those of us who are familiar with, United States history, history of the civil rights movement, and sort of Black intellectual thought in the 19th and 20th century, something like what you describe of the connections in Cuba may make sense, or the Caribbean, or people going in the 1950s and 60s to Africa in decolonizing countries. but you also have a pretty significant story in the book about connections in Japan prior to World War II. And so, can you tell that story and explain what was happening?
Yes, and I will say too that this has been a topic of great interest to me, Afro-Asian solidarity in general. But I've been so intrigued by the connections between African Americans and Japan and Japanese activists in the 20th century, and so I was thrilled to be able to delve into this a bit in Without Fear. One of the things that I emphasize is the role of Madam C.J. Walker. I think so many people are familiar with her. We talk about her as a self-made millionaire, certainly very successful, prominent Black woman entrepreneur. And most people probably might know that she had global interests, might know that she traveled to Haiti, for example, but might be surprised to know that she was, in fact, a key player in Black internationalist history in the 20th century, and particularly through her support of and her help in establishing the International League for Darker Peoples, or the ILDP, in 1919. I talk about in the book how she, in fact, uses her home in upstate New York, brings uh, activists, a prominent activist, including someone like Marcus Garvey, who's connected to the Universal Negro Improvement Association, as well as A. Philip Randolph, well-known labor organizer, and she brings a range of political figures to her home for this important gathering to launch the ILDP. And the group is very significant for a range of reasons, but I talk about them particularly in the context of the Paris Peace Conference. And one of the goals of the group was essentially um, to put forth an equality proposal. Of course, this is a moment in which, uh, as you mentioned earlier, African Americans are still fighting to be recognized as citizens of the United States. So that fight is happening, and at the same time, they're also responding to global developments. They're talking about colonialism. They're talking about the need to bring an end to colonialism, and they believe that the Paris Peace Conference might be a space in which to advocate powerfully for all of these things. One of the strategies they use is to try to connect with Japanese officials who will be at the Paris Peace Conference, and so the ILDP, and here is where Madam C.J. Walker plays an important role. She helps to organize a meeting with members of the ILDP, and several Japanese officials who are going to be at the conference, and essentially asking them to agree to push and to advocate for an equality clause that would, of course, be beneficial to Black people, but be beneficial to many marginalized groups at the time. And so it becomes this somewhat a covert but powerful strategy to push one's vision when you don't have an opportunity, when you don't have a seat at the table, when you don't have an opportunity to make your demands known, to be able to connect with, to form a solidarity, political alliances with others who have the opportunity to be in the room, and to ask them and to plead with them to make a case that they speak on your behalf, but and as well as theirs. Of course, it is a more nuanced story, and as I get into, as I talk about in the book, lots of complexity when you're talking about 20th century. You talk about Japan and imperialism. There's that's partly why it fascinates me so much, because it does
Yeah.
in some ways seem like an unlikely alliance, but it is an important alliance nonetheless. And Madam C.J. Walker is part of that story, and I talk about the maneuvering. I talk about just the meetings that are taking place between the activists, and in the end, the LGP, they're not successful in terms of they're not able to um, get their goals, all of their goals met. But it's not about that.
Yeah.
It's for me, it is really about the attempt. It's about the strategizing. It's about people coming together and trying to figure out a way to push for greater rights. for themselves and for others. And it's, I think, quite remarkable to see Madam C.J. Walker as just initiating this conversation. She's even giving up of her resources, her money to keep the organization afloat. And so it is a powerful glimpse of Black women's internationalist politics that we don't often see.
Absolutely. And while you're talking, I'm thinking about something that actually I heard yesterday, just in a private fellowship call that we had here at Carr Ryan, where Shoshana Zuboff,
Mhm.
who, author of the tome Surveillance Capitalism, former retired HBS professor, Harvard Business School here at Harvard, an incredible friend of the center here. And she said that something like the love of humanity is a love of the future, and a fundamental truth about human rights work is, of course, it's heavy work. It's calling out injustice where and when it pops up, but it also is fundamentally hopeful. It has to be. And all of your protagonists underscore this, especially this Madam CJ Walker you were just describing this moment. She would not have attempted this strategy if she didn't think it would move the needle or didn't hope that it would move the needle. And even if it, quote unquote, failed to come fully through fruition, it did move things a step forward. And I just find that so beautiful and important right now in this political moment we're in, where a lot is just coming at us all the time and feels like things are being pushed back across many, many, many fronts. Um, just to remember that human rights work is fundamentally hopeful work is very helpful to me personally right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's so true, and it's one of the reasons why I think the publication of this book, despite all the challenges of the moment, I do think it is the right time to release a book like this. And um, I also just even recently started reflecting on the title. Of course, when you're writing projects, you don't often know how things will resonate. But at the time, of course, in selecting the title Without Fear, this comes from a quote from Mary McLeod Bethune, Without Fear and Hesitancy, as she's making an appeal to Black women and saying, we can come together, we can do this work, and let's do so without fear and hesitancy. And I wanted to emphasize that in this book, and never imagined that it would mean so much for all of us in this moment. What does it mean to do the work that's important to us and do so uh, without fear?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there aren't many things to be afraid of, and then there aren't many challenges to be aware of. But I think it's intentional that Mary Bethune, that she's saying those words to Black women. I can imagine them listening to her in the 1940s and what it must have meant for them, and now to think about what it means for us when we say it's important to do this work without fear.
Yeah, completely. Thank you. Is there any other story you want to share from the book, or do you want to keep it for the book and make people read it?
Well, I'll share one more story, and this is just a snapshot of another woman who I talk about by the name of Pearl Sherrod, and I think it connects so nicely to the conversation that we've had about Afro-Asian solidarity, about Madam C.J. Walker, because Pearl Sherrod is a working class, perhaps working poor, would be more accurate, working poor Black woman from Detroit, someone who most people have never heard of. I had not heard of Pearl Sherrod until I was doing the research. And then I started studying her several years ago while I was actually writing my first book. One of the things that's amazing about Pearl Sherrod is that she has this idea of human rights, and for her, it's very similar to the work that the ILDP did just several years prior. And so she's in Detroit in the 1930s, and one can see the connections between what she's doing in the 30s compared to what's happening in 1919. And she's making this broad argument that Black people do need to form alliances with Asian activists. They need to come together to challenge imperialism, to challenge racism. So all of these things she's emphasizing, and she doesn't quite have a platform, if you will. So one of the things that she ends up doing, in addition to really organizing on the ground, she ends up writing a column, and I talk about this, the interesting circumstances around how she ends up writing this column. But it becomes a window into her ideas about human rights. So I draw on this. And then she makes this grand appearance in 1937. She travels to Vancouver, Canada, and attends the conference of the Pan Pacific Women's Association. That's such a critical moment because, according to the historical records, she pretty much showed up. She had not been invited. They didn't know who she was, and she essentially grabbed the mic. I mean, it's just a remarkable moment
It's the
of people
best.
staring like, "Who is this person and what is happening?" And she
Yeah.
walks to the front. And she essentially gives this powerful speech. It's a human rights speech. It's a one that's calling on for unity, for collaboration, and she's talking about the challenges that Black people are facing in the United States and drawing connections to what's happening globally. And newspapers or documents, people write about later this person who just showed up and gave this speech, and I just think about how powerful that is. This ordinary Black woman who doesn't have a lot of resources, no one knew, no one invited her, and yet she left a mark and really opened up a space, opened up a door for so many others to follow. So truly inspiring. Of course, one of the reasons that I do the work that I do, it really helps me when I learn about just the strategies that others who came before me employed to make it through some very difficult moments, and it gives me a sense of hope that I can get through uh, this difficult moment, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely get that. Thank you so much for this beautiful book and for putting your amazing brain to this work and telling these stories. Really, I love the book and I hope everyone has the time to read it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.